The hum of the server room was my constant companion, a dull, monotonous drone that had replaced the crackle of static and the whisper of the cosmos I'd once chased. Dust motes danced in the sterile fluorescent light, each one a tiny, forgotten world. My world these days was confined to screens, to lines of code and data streams that promised patterns but delivered only noise. I, Dean, once a man who mapped nebulae and dreamed of alien suns, now spent my days sifting through the digital detritus of 1,000 failed projects. Disillusionment was a heavy cloak, woven from years of grant rejections, bureaucratic hurdles, and the gnawing realization that the universe, at least from my vantage point, was far less wondrous and far more empty than the textbooks suggested. My office, a cramped cubicle at the edge of this sprawling, echoing research facility, felt like a tomb. The stale air, thick with the scent of old paper and cheap coffee, did little to stir the embers of my former enthusiasm. I'd stare out the reinforced window, the sky a washed-out canvas that offered no inspiration. The sheer, vast indifference of it all had finally seeped into my bones. I'd stopped looking up. It was during one of these aimless drifts through archival data, a task assigned more out of a need to keep me occupied than any real expectation of discovery, that I stumbled upon it, a peculiar blip, nestled in a sector of space that should have been as featureless as a blank page. Not a rogue asteroid, not a known celestial body. This was different. It was a signal, faint but undeniably structured, a whisper from the void that prickled the hairs on my arms. My fingers, stiff from disuse, flew across the keyboard. I pulled up the raw data, the spectral analysis. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered, not a natural phenomenon. It possessed an almost deliberate quality, a pulse, a rhythm. My heart, which I'd thought had long since calcified, gave a tentative thud against my ribs. This was it, I told myself. This was the reason I'd spent years staring at the stars. I cross-referenced the coordinates. Sector 7G. No stars, no planets, no nebulae, just nothing, yet the signal persisted. It was a needle in a haystack, a lighthouse in an ocean of black. For the first time in years, a spark ignited within me, a flicker of the old hunger. This wasn't just noise, this was a message. I spent the next few days consumed. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My colleagues, a scattered collection of academics and technicians, barely registered my presence. Their routines were as predictable as the tides. The quiet click of keyboards, the murmur of hushed conversations, the distant clang of machinery. They were content in their ordered universe. I was no longer. The signal was a puzzle, intricate and maddening. It didn't conform to any known communication protocols, any established cosmic language. It was a series of complex mathematical sequences, interwoven with what appeared to be harmonic resonances. It felt ancient, impossibly ancient. My research took me down rabbit holes I hadn't explored in years. Ancient astronomical charts, obscure theoretical physics papers, even anthropological texts that hinted at forgotten celestial observations. It was in one of these dusty tomes, a collection of folklore from a remote region, that I found a curious passage. It spoke of a place, deep within an uncharted jungle, where the elders warned all away. A place they called the Temple in Jungle. Locals refused to speak of it. But the coordinates, when I finally managed to triangulate them using the signal's subtle directional variations, were disturbingly close to the region described. The signal, I realized, wasn't just coming from Sector 7G. It was somehow connected to this remote, forgotten corner of Earth. How? Why? The logic of it eluded me, twisting my thoughts into knots. The signal's rhythm began to change, subtly at first, then with an increasing urgency. It was like a heartbeat accelerating, a frantic plea or a warning. I felt a growing unease, a sense that I was peering into something I wasn't meant to see. The sterile hum of the server room seemed to deepen, to take on a resonant quality, as if it were vibrating in sympathy with the distant transmission. I leaned back in my chair, my palms slick with sweat. The data on my screen swam before my eyes. This wasn't just a scientific anomaly. It felt alive, and it was calling to me. But what was it calling me to, and what would happen if I answered? The server room's hum felt louder tonight, or maybe it was just me straining to hear something beyond its mechanical thrum. I'd been poring over the data for weeks, the initial thrill of discovery curdling into a gnawing unease. This wasn't just a signal, it was a whisper from a place that shouldn't have a voice, a void, an impossible null. I traced the spectral lines again, my finger sliding across the cool glass of the monitor. There, the anomaly. It wasn't a broadcast, not in any sense I understood. No Doppler shift, no discernible carrier wave, just presence. A coherent pattern, impossibly dense, impossibly old, blooming in a patch of space that should have been as silent as a tomb. My colleagues had dismissed it, of course. Interference, they'd said. A glitch. Dean, they'd gently chided, my eyes are playing tricks. But my eyes weren't playing tricks. My gut was screaming. I'd started isolating it, stripping away the background radiation. The faint cosmic microwave hum, everything. What remained was this. It wasn't random. It was structured like a language, but one composed of forces I couldn't even begin to quantify. The sheer mathematical elegance of it, the impossible precision, felt less like a discovery and more like an intrusion. It was like finding a perfectly formed fractal etched into the surface of a black hole. A shadow fell across my console. I jumped, my heart giving a sudden, unwelcome lurch. It was the facility manager, a gruff man, all thinning gray hair and permanent frown lines etched by years of battling recalcitrant machinery. He smelled faintly of oil and old coffee. "Still here, Dean?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the close air. "Thought you'd be home by now." I forced a smile. "Just a few more checks. You know how it is." He peered over my shoulder, his gaze sweeping across the cascading lines of code and graphs. He wouldn't understand the specifics, not really, but he understood urgency. He understood obsession. He'd seen it in the eyes of researchers before, the ones who got too close to the edge of what was known. "Anything interesting?" he asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes lingered on the unusual waveform I'd isolated. "It's complex," I admitted, choosing my words carefully. "Anomalous energy signature, nothing like we've ever seen." He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. Skepticism, curiosity, dismissal. "Space is a big place, Dean. Lots of weirdness out there." "This isn't just weirdness," I said, my voice dropping. "It's ordered, impossible." He turned his gaze on me then, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place in his weathered face. It wasn't quite pity, not quite concern, more like a weary recognition. "You chasing ghosts again, Dean?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. He knew about my previous expeditions. I told myself I was done with that, done with the pursuit of the unknowable. But this signal, it was different. It wasn't a theory, wasn't a hypothesis. It was data, solid, undeniable, terrifying data. "This is different," I insisted, my voice firmer than I felt. "This is real." He just nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the screen. "Keep at it then. But don't forget to eat and sleep. The machines need you sharp." He clapped a hand on my shoulder, a surprisingly gentle gesture for such a rough-hewn man, and then he was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of oil and the amplified hum of the servers. Alone again, I turned back to the data. The facility manager's skepticism was a familiar weight, a counterpoint to the exhilarating, terrifying pull of the signal. But even he, in his own way, had acknowledged its strangeness. He'd seen the impossible waveform. I zoomed in, pushing the resolution to its absolute limit. The patterns within the signal shifted, coalesced, reformed. It was like watching a crystal grow, but at an impossible speed in impossible dimensions. And then I saw it. Tiny, almost imperceptible variations. Not random fluctuations, but deliberate, intricate modifications. As if the signal itself was learning, adapting. It wasn't just an anomaly. It was a presence. And it was responding, but to what? To my analysis, to my attention. The implications, vast and incomprehensible, began to dawn. This wasn't just a signal from an empty sector. It was a message, and the sender was not of this universe. I leaned back, the worn fabric of my chair creaking under my weight. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for my lukewarm coffee. The hum of the servers seemed to recede, replaced by a new internal resonance, a deep, unsettling thrum that echoed the impossible signal. I was no longer just an astrophysicist analyzing data. I was a listener, perched on the edge of a precipice, hearing a voice that had existed long before the stars and would likely exist long after them. And the signal, it continued to change. Not faster, but deeper, more complex. It was as if it was unfolding, revealing layers of information that defied logic, that defied existence itself. What was it trying to communicate? And why was it reaching out now, across impossible gulfs of time and space to me? The heavy door of the observatory's control room groaned shut. the sound swallowed by the hum of the machines. I was alone again, the scent of oil and something else, something faintly metallic and sharp, lingering in the air. It wasn't unpleasant, just alien, like the signal itself. I ran a hand over my stubbled chin. The rough texture, a small anchor to the familiar. The director's words echoed in my mind, "Keep at it then, but don't forget to eat and sleep." He was right, of course, but sleep felt like a luxury I couldn't afford, not when the universe was whispering secrets I was finally starting to hear. I turned back to the console, the glowing screens, a familiar, comforting constellation of data. The anomalous signal, designated X7, was still there, a persistent, rhythmic pulse in the otherwise silent void of Sector Gamma 9. For weeks, it had been a ghost in the machine, an impossible anomaly that defied all conventional explanations. I'd run every diagnostic, cross-referenced every known celestial phenomenon, but X7 remained stubbornly, defiantly unique. My fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up spectral analysis logs. The usual static, the faint hiss of cosmic background radiation, all the comforting noise of the universe. Then the spike, X7, it wasn't just a pulse, it was a complex waveform layered with sub-frequencies that shifted and reformed with an unnerving intelligence. It was too ordered, too deliberate to be natural. My gaze flickered to the satellite feeds, the black expanse of Gamma 9 staring back, utterly devoid of stars, nebulae, or any discernible celestial body. Empty, or so it seemed. I spent the next few hours lost in the intricate dance of numbers and graphs. The signal's pattern was not random. It was a language, I was sure of it, but unlike any I had ever encountered. It wasn't based on mathematical sequences or phonetic structures. It was something deeper, something that resonated on a primal level, like a forgotten chord struck in the deepest recesses of the cosmos. My eyes burned. The artificial light of the monitors, a stark contrast to the deepening twilight outside. The air in the control room grew thick, heavy with the silent, expectant energy of the machines. Then, a breakthrough. A recurring sequence within the signal, a series of harmonic convergences that, when isolated and amplified, revealed a faint underlying structure. It was like finding a single, perfectly formed pearl in an ocean of sand. I traced its origin, my heart thrumming a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. The data pointed not to a distant star system, but to something far closer, something terrestrial. My breath hitched. This was impossible. The signal's origin point was a pinpoint, impossibly small, impossibly stable. It wasn't a celestial object. It was localized. I rerouted power, pushing the main array to its limits, focusing its immense sensitivity on the coordinates. The image that resolved on the screen made the hairs on my arms stand on end. It was a structure, ancient, weathered, and impossibly out of place. Stone, worn smooth by millennia of wind and rain, formed a sprawling, intricate edifice nestled deep within a dense, emerald jungle. Vines choked its crumbling walls, and the canopy above was so thick that only dappled shafts of sunlight managed to pierce through, illuminating patches of moss-covered stone. It was the temple in jungle. Locals refused to speak of it. I'd seen it on old geological surveys, a curiosity dismissed as a minor archaeological find, its true nature lost to time and local superstition. But the signal, X7, wasn't emanating from space. It was emanating from there, from that forgotten place, buried beneath layers of earth and legend. I zoomed in, the resolution straining. The temple was vast, its architecture unlike anything I'd ever studied. They weren't pictures, they were concepts, impressions, feelings rendered in stone. A low hum, almost imperceptible, seemed to emanate from the screen itself, a resonant frequency that vibrated in my teeth. Then I saw it. At the center of the main courtyard, where the densest concentration of the signal seemed to originate, was a single, obsidian-like monolith. And etched onto its surface, glowing with a faint, internal luminescence, was a symbol. My hand trembled as I reached out, my fingertip hovering inches from the screen. This wasn't just a discovery, it was a revelation. The signal wasn't coming from space. It was coming from us, or rather from something that had been here long before us, something that had built this temple, and now it was reaching out, but to whom and why? What had I woken up? The air in the control room hung thick, a cloying mix of stale coffee and that persistent, sharp tang. It was a smell I'd come to associate with the signal, a phantom scent that clung to my clothes, my hair. I ran a hand over the smooth, cool metal of the console, my fingers tracing the illuminated readouts. Nothing. The signal was gone, vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. For hours, I'd scoured the logs, reran diagnostics, checked every sensor. It was as if the universe had hiccuped, a brief, impassable anomaly, and then smoothed itself back into place. But I knew what I'd heard. I felt it. My gaze drifted to the reinforced window, the dark expanse outside usually a comfort, a familiar canvas of stars. Tonight, it felt vast and indifferent, a silent witness to my growing unease. The jungle pressed in, a wall of impenetrable blackness beyond the observatory's perimeter lights. I could hear the night sounds, the chirps and rustles of unseen creatures, but tonight they seemed to carry a new, discordant note, a subtle dissonance that grated on my nerves. I needed to get out of here. The isolation was starting to gnaw at me. The signal, or the absence of it, had left a void, an uncomfortable silence that screamed louder than any noise. I thought of the nearby village, the wary glances I'd received, the hushed conversations that ceased the moment I approached. They knew something. They felt something. A sudden flicker of the lights made me jump. The backup generator, usually as reliable as a heartbeat, sputtered. My breath hitched. It was just a power fluctuation, I told myself, just the old building groaning. But the metallic tang in the air seemed to intensify, sharp and biting, like ozone before a lightning strike. I stood, my legs feeling oddly heavy as if the gravity had shifted. I needed to see the source of that signal. Even if it was gone, the coordinates were burned into my mind. The elder's words echoed, "Some doors, once opened, can never be closed." Had I already crossed that threshold? The jungle path was treacherous even in daylight. Now, under the sliver of a moon, it was a labyrinth of grasping roots and unseen obstacles. The air grew heavy, humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The familiar jungle symphony was muted, replaced by an unnerving stillness. The usual chorus of insects was absent, the rustling of nocturnal animals a distant memory. It was as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. The path narrowed, the undergrowth closing in. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, a growing awareness of being watched. It wasn't the furtive gaze of a jungle predator, but something vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent. Then I heard it. A low, guttural hum vibrating not in the air, but deep within my bones. It was the same resonance I'd felt when the signal was active, a sound that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my primal core. The flashlight beam trembled, catching glimpses of something unnatural ahead. The trees thinned, revealing a clearing, and in the center of that clearing, silhouetted against the faint moonlight, stood the temple. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not built, but grown, the stone fused and warped as if by immense heat, or perhaps something far more insidious. Strange, geometric patterns, alien and unsettling, were etched into its surface, pulsing with a faint, internal luminescence. This was it, the temple in jungle. Locals refused to speak of it. As I stepped into the clearing, the hum intensified, a physical pressure building in my chest. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, yielding, almost soft. I looked down, my blood turning to ice. It oozed from cracks in the stone, a slow, deliberate seep. My flashlight beam swept across the temple's facade. The etched patterns shifted, reformed, coalescing into shapes that made my mind reel. They weren't merely carvings, they were alive, shifting with an impassable geometry, hinting at dimensions I couldn't comprehend. A sense of profound wrongness washed over me, a certainty that I was standing on the precipice of something that should remain forever hidden. The metallic tang was overpowering now, sharp and acrid, burning my nostrils. It wasn't a voice, not in the human sense, but a collection of sounds that coalesced into a single, terrifying idea: presence. I spun around, my heart racing, revealing, unmaking. My hand instinctively went to my pocket, searching for the small metallic device I'd salvaged from the observatory's wreckage. It was supposed to be a translator, a tool to decipher the signal. Now it felt like a child's toy against the immensity of what I was facing. The hum reached a crescendo, a deafening thrum that vibrated through my entire being. The luminescence of the temple flared, casting the clearing in an unearthly glow. The etched patterns writhed, seeming to reach out. I had to know, I had to understand. But as I took another step towards the temple, the ground beneath my feet gave way. Panic flared, hot and sharp. I clawed at the slick surface, my hands finding no purchase. Was this the price of curiosity? Was this the nature of the signal? The air in the clearing was thick, heavy with a scent I couldn't quite place. Damp earth, yes, but something else, something acrid and metallic, like old blood mixed with ozone. The hum was a constant thrumming in my bones now, not just in my ears. It vibrated through the soles of my boots, up my legs, settling in my teeth. I'd seen plenty of strange things in my career, anomalies that defied conventional physics, but this was different. This felt alive. I'd followed the signal here, to this forgotten pocket of the jungle, a place the locals spoke of only in hushed, fearful whispers. They called it the Temple in Jungle. Locals refused to speak of it, and now I understood why. The structure itself was ancient, its stones worn smooth by millennia of rain and wind, yet the carvings, barely discernible beneath a creeping moss, were unlike any I'd ever encountered. They weren't geometric or representational. They were fluid, organic, like frozen tendrils of smoke, or monstrous, skeletal limbs reaching for an unseen sky. The viscous substance underfoot continued to pulse. I knelt, my gloved hand hovering just above its surface. It didn't reflect light. It seemed to absorb it, a patch of absolute, unsettling darkness. This wasn't just some geological oddity. This was a manifestation. My mind raced, trying to fit this into any framework I knew. Biology, geology. Neither felt right. This felt older, more fundamental. It was a siren song luring me into a truth that made my carefully constructed universe crumble. I needed more. I needed context. This wasn't a scientific puzzle to be solved. It was a warning. But a warning about what and from whom, or what? I stood, my legs feeling heavy, and began to circle the perimeter of the clearing. The jungle pressed in, a wall of dense green, alive with the chatter of unseen insects and the distant cries of birds that sounded unnervingly like screams. I kept my eyes on the temple, on the pulsating ground, but my senses were on high alert, straining to catch any deviation, any sign of movement. My comm unit, usually a lifeline, was dead. No signal, not even static. It was as if the very air here was anathema to technology. I was truly alone, armed only with my training, my equipment, and a growing, sickening certainty that I had stumbled onto something that should have remained buried. Tales of forgotten civilizations, of entities that predated humanity, of cosmic forces that shaped reality before the first star ignited. I dismissed them as folklore, as the fevered dreams of minds lost to obsession. The carvings on the temple walls, they weren't random. I traced one with my finger, the moss cool and damp against the rough stone. It depicted a shape, a vast, impossible geometry that seemed to fold in on itself, a nexus of lines that shouldn't exist in 3 dimensions. As I stared, the lines seemed to shift, to reconfigure themselves, a dizzying, nauseating effect. It was like looking into a mirror that showed not my reflection, but something else. A low growl, deep and guttural, echoed from the dense foliage to my left. My head snapped up. My heart, despite my best efforts, gave a traitorous lurch. I reached for the heavy flashlight clipped to my belt, my fingers fumbling slightly. It wasn't a jungle cat. The sound was too wrong, too resonant. It felt like it originated not from a throat, but from the very earth itself. I backed away slowly, my gaze sweeping the tree line. The hum intensified, a palpable pressure building against my eardrums. The viscous substance on the ground rippled, as if something were moving beneath its surface. I could feel it now, a subtle tremor, a slow, deliberate shift. What was buried here? What ancient horror had this temple been built to contain, or perhaps to worship? My breathing grew shallow. The metallic tang in the air sharpened, making my throat ache. I needed to get out of here to find a way to understand what I was facing. But the jungle seemed to have sealed itself around me, and the temple, with its pulsing heart, held me captive. Was I the only one who had ever found this place, or had others come before me? Only to be consumed. It vibrated through the soles of my boots, up my legs, settling into my teeth. I was deep within the jungle, a place the local guides had vehemently refused to enter, their faces pale and their whispers filled with a nameless dread when I'd pressed them about the strange readings. They'd called it the Temple in Jungle, locals refused to speak of it, and now I understood why. The trees here were ancient, their roots snaking over moss-covered stones like petrified serpents. Moonlight, filtered through the impossibly dense canopy, cast shifting skeletal shadows that danced with a life of their own. The hum intensified, a physical pressure against my eardrums, making my vision blur at the edges. Ahead, through a curtain of hanging vines, I saw it. A structure, ancient and weathered, rising from the jungle floor. Not a building in the conventional sense, but a series of interlocking monoliths. Obsidian black and impassably smooth, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe just at the periphery of my vision. The air around it shimmered, as if heat was rising from the stone, though the night was cool and damp. This was the source, the signal, my obsession. I took a step forward, my boot crunching on a fallen, brittle leaf. The hum, it was coming from them, or rather through them. My breath hitched. The symbols on the stones weren't just carvings, they were moving. Not in a way that suggested animation, but a subtle, organic shift, like watching tectonic plates grind together in slow motion. The acrid metallic smell was stronger here, so potent it made my stomach churn. It was the smell of decay, of something vast and ancient that had died and was now impossibly stirring. I raised my hand, my fingers trembling, and reached out towards the nearest monolith. It was cool to the touch, unnervingly so, despite the shimmering air. As my fingertips made contact, the hum surged. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated wrongness that slammed into me. My knees buckled. I gasped, pulling my hand back as if burned. The symbols on the stone pulsed, a faint internal luminescence blooming beneath the surface. It was like a heartbeat, slow and ancient, resonating with something deep within the earth, or perhaps deep within me. I stumbled back, my eyes wide. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was a gateway, a point of connection, and whatever was on the other side was waking up. The signal wasn't a transmission. It was a tremor, a ripple from a reality that was beginning to bleed into ours. I fumbled for my handheld scanner, my fingers clumsy and numb. The readings were off the charts, a chaotic symphony of energies I couldn't even begin to classify. It was as if the very laws of physics were fraying at the edges, unraveling around this site. Then I saw it, a distortion in the air right in the center of the monoliths. It was subtle at first, like heat haze on a summer road, but it grew, expanding, shimmering. Within the distortion, shapes began to form, not solid objects, but suggestions, impressions of things that defied logic. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was it, the climax. The thing I had chased across the stars, the whisper in the static, was now manifesting before me. It was immense, an entity of pure, unfathomable scale, and it was tearing a hole in existence. I had a choice. I could run, try to escape this impossible horror, or I could do something, but what? I was just one man, armed with a scanner and a desperate, perhaps foolish curiosity. The metallic, acrid scent intensified, burning my nostrils. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating not just in my bones, but in my very soul. I looked at the scanner, then at the unfolding impossibility before me. The resolution would come one way or another, but the path there felt like it was being carved out of my own sanity. Could I even comprehend what was happening, let alone stop it? The hum. It was still there, a low, insistent vibration that had burrowed its way into my very marrow. Even now, miles away from that oppressive clearing, it resonated. I was back in my cramped apartment. Familiar scent of old coffee grounds, and dust, a stark contrast to the alien tang that still clung to my memory. The walls, usually a comforting beige, seemed to press in, their stillness a mocking counterpoint to the chaos that had erupted. I traced the faint, shimmering lines on my palm, a phantom warmth lingering where the entity's touch had seared. It wasn't a burn, not in the conventional sense. It was more like an imprint, a brand that spoke of a reality folded and refolded, of dimensions I couldn't even begin to grasp. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from a profound exhaustion, the kind that settles deep in my soul after staring into an abyss. My equipment lay scattered across the floor, the portable receiver, its antenna bent at an unnatural angle, the datapad with its cracked screen, the audio recorder, its red light blinking a silent accusation. I'd salvaged what I could, a desperate attempt to cling to the tangible after encountering the utterly intangible. But the data was corrupted. Fragments of impossible waveforms, static that coalesced into something that felt like laughter, then dissolved into shrieks. It was like trying to capture smoke with a sieve. I ran a hand over my face, the stubble rough against my skin. Sleep was a distant memory, a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time I closed my eyes, the clearing would reassert itself, the suffocating humidity, the impossibly ancient trees, their branches twisted like arthritic fingers. I tried to explain, of course. To a colleague, the one who'd always humored my wilder theories. He'd listened, his brow furrowed with a practiced concern, his eyes holding that familiar, pitying glaze. He'd spoken of stress, of overwork, of needing a break. He hadn't seen the shimmer. He hadn't heard the resonance. He hadn't felt the universe tilt on its axis. The locals, they knew. I saw it in their averted gazes, the way they'd hurried their children inside as I approached their village. The elder, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, had simply shaken his head when I'd asked about the temple in jungle. Locals refused to speak of it. His silence was more eloquent than any pronouncement. I stood by the window, the city lights a dull, indifferent glow below. They felt so small, so utterly insignificant. My world, the world of celestial mechanics and observable phenomena, had been a fragile construct, a thin veneer over something vast and unspeakably old. And I, in my hubris, had peeled back a corner of that veneer. The signal. It had been a key, a perfect, impossible fit for a lock I hadn't known existed. And what had I found on the other side? Not answers, not discoveries, but a gnawing certainty that some doors are meant to remain shut. The entity, if that's what it was, hadn't attacked me. It had observed, and in that observation it had left its mark, a promise, a threat. I walked over to my bookshelf, my fingers brushing against the spines of familiar texts. Astrophysics, cosmology, quantum mechanics. They felt like children's stories now, quaint fables about a universe that was far more polite than the one I'd glimpsed. The hum seemed to intensify, a subtle shift in pitch that only I could perceive. It was like a conversation, one I was slowly, terrifyingly beginning to understand. The imprint on my palm throbbed. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a resonance, a tuning fork struck against the very fabric of my being. I felt a connection, a thread pulled taut between me and it, whatever it was. The implication sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Had it followed me? There was this connection a one-way street, or could it sense my awareness? I picked up the datapad again, ignoring the fractured screen. I had to try. I had to find something, anything, to make sense of what I had experienced. But the corrupted files mocked me, a chaotic symphony of the incomprehensible. The more I looked, the less I understood. It was like trying to read a language written in shifting starlight. I shivered, pulling my worn sweater tighter. The hum was a constant now, a low thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very walls. It wasn't just in my bones anymore. It was in the air I breathed, in the blood that coursed through my veins. I looked at my hands, the lines on my palm glowing with a faint internal light. The imprint felt more pronounced now, a burning brand that pulsed in time with the unseen rhythm. There was this what it meant to be touched by something so utterly alien, to have my very essence rewritten. I walked back to the window, the city lights a blur of indifferent pinpricks. But here, in my apartment, the silence was being filled by the hum, filled by the echo of something ancient and vast. My gaze drifted to the night sky, a vast star-dusted canvas. It looked the same, yet I knew it was irrevocably changed. And I, fool that I was, had answered. What had I invited into my life? What had I awakened? The hum. I was back in my cramped apartment, the familiar scent of old coffee grounds, and dust a stark contrast to the alien tang that still clung to my clothes. A phantom whisper of ozone and something far older. The anomalies, the impossible data points, the sheer, unyielding wrongness of it all. It wasn't just a signal. It was a scar, a wound in existence, bleeding something I couldn't name. I tried to rationalize it, to find a flaw in my own calculations, a cosmic ray hitting the wrong sensor at the wrong time. But the pattern, the undeniable mathematical elegance of its intrusion, spoke of something deliberate, something that had been waiting. The locals, their averted gazes, the hurried crossing of themselves, the way they'd practically shoved me away from the edge of the tree line, their fear a palpable thing, thick and suffocating. They knew, they'd always known. The temple in jungle, locals refused to speak of. It wasn't just a ruin, it was a ward, a forgotten penance. And I, in my arrogant pursuit of knowledge, had pricked the ancient scab. I ran a hand over my face, the stubble rough against my fingertips. The image of the sky that night, rippling like disturbed water, was seared behind my eyelids. Not a celestial phenomenon, something else, something that had looked back. I'd felt it, a vast, indifferent awareness that had momentarily brushed against my own consciousness, like a titan noticing an ant. And the hum, it was the echo of that touch. I needed to go back. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen, couldn't unhear what I'd heard. The universe was not the benevolent, orderly place I'd spent my life studying. It was a vast, indifferent ocean, and something ancient and terrible swam in its deepest trenches. The journey back was a blur of feverish determination. I chartered a small plane, then hired a guide, a stoic man with eyes that held a weariness far beyond his years. He didn't ask questions, and I offered no explanations. We traveled for days, the humid air pressing in. The jungle a suffocating green wall that seemed to swallow sound. The hum, though fainter, was a constant companion, a low thrumming beneath the chirping insects and the rustle of unseen creatures. When we finally reached the clearing, the air was heavy, charged with a static anticipation. The temple in jungle, locals refused to speak of it, loomed before me, its stone weathered and choked with vines. The locals had been right to fear it. I approached the central altar, stone cool and strangely smooth beneath my trembling fingers. The carvings were unlike anything I'd ever encountered, geometric patterns that shifted and reformed in my peripheral vision, hinting at impossible dimensions. This was the nexus, the point where the veil had thinned. I pulled out the modified receiver, its circuits humming with its own faint energy. I'd spent weeks recalibrating it, trying to isolate the original signal to understand its source. As I powered it on, the hum intensified, vibrating not just in my ears, but in my teeth, in my bones. The needle on the display swung wildly, then settled, pointing not at a star, but at the ground beneath my feet. It wasn't coming from space. It was coming from below. A guttural sound tore from my throat, a strangled gasp. The signal wasn't an interstellar broadcast, it was a resonance. A vibration that had bled through the very bedrock of this world, amplified by the ancient stones of this forgotten place. The entity hadn't arrived. It had always been here, slumbering, its dreams the source of the hum. I looked at the receiver, then at the ancient altar. The carvings seemed to writhe now, the geometric shapes coalescing into something that resembled an eye, vast and fathomless. The hum reached a crescendo, a piercing note that threatened to shatter my skull. I understood then. There was no repelling it, no defeating it. The receiver sputtered, then died. I was alone in the clearing, the ancient temple a tomb. I turned to leave, my legs heavy, my mind numb. The guide was nowhere to be seen. Had he fled, or had he simply ceased to be? I didn't know, I didn't care. What was it waiting for?